Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Books and Books in Coral Gables. Thank you all for coming down tonight. Quick announcement for our internet audience at home. If at any time during the presentation you would like to purchase a copy of Professor Latell's book, you can call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We'll have Professor Latell sign it for you, and we will also ship it to you for free anywhere in the United States. Also, later on during the question and answer period, if you have a question for Professor Latell, call in the store and we will be able to get your question to him. Well, this evening, Books and Books is very pleased to welcome back Professor Brian Latell, presenting the updated version of his acclaimed book, Castro's Secrets, Cuban Intelligence, the CIA, and the Assassination of John F. Kennedy. Professor Latell is currently Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami. He previously taught for a quarter century at Georgetown University. He began tracking the Castro brothers for the CIA in the 1960s, and he is the author of the previous book, After Fidel, which has been published in 8 languages. In this book, Professor Latell draws on interviews with high-level defectors from Cuban intelligence and chronicles Castro's crimes from his university days through his nearly 50 years in power. He argues that the CIA grossly underestimated the extraordinary ability of the Cubans to run moles and double agents and to penetrate the highest levels of American institutions. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Professor Brian Latell.
Thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction. Good to see you all, some old friends, new friends. Good to see everybody. Thanks. I'm not sure that I'll need the mic because we have a pretty small room here. Do we need the mic? The book Castro's Secrets is recently out in paperback. It's a new and expanded edition. It has a brand new chapter, about an 8,000-word chapter that brings the story, frankly, in some new directions. When I wrote the book originally, the hardback book, I guess I was just a little too reluctant to come to closure about some of the critical issues involving Cuban intelligence, Fidel Castro, and Lee Harvey Oswald. I was also perhaps too reluctant when I wrote the hardback book to come to a more critical stance with regard to the organization where I worked for 35 years, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Johnson administration, which I also worked for. So this new edition, the paperback edition, has some much tougher, I think, harsher judgments about CIA, about FBI, about President Johnson, in terms of cover-ups, about the refusal of those men, Richard Helms at CIA, J. Edgar Hoover, not surprisingly, at FBI, and others, Robert Kennedy, and I think ultimately the new president, Lyndon Johnson, were highly reluctant to provide the Warren Commission with evidence that could have led the Warren Commission to some very different directions, possibly even to some very different conclusions. So those kinds of things are in the new book. They're in the paperback edition of Castro's Secrets in an 8,000-word introduction that I wrote early this year and got it into the book and the book was just published a few months ago. So where should I start? Do I need to stand here for the whole presentation? I do, for the for the streaming, the live streaming. Let me start with Fidel Castro, which is he's really the key in this entire story. Castro, about 30 hours after Jack Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Fidel Castro went on Cuban television. He was broadcast live, and very quickly into that speech, reacting to the Kennedy assassination, he spoke of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he said this: These are his exact words. We never in our lives heard of him. And then he repeated that in a slightly different context. We never in our lives heard of him. A couple of days later, Castro went to the University of Havana. He spoke there. He spoke again about the Kennedy assassination. And he referred to Lee Harvey Oswald's days in Mexico City in September, the end of September 1963. That was 7 weeks before Oswald assassinated the president. Oswald went to Mexico City. He was in and out of the Cuban consulate. He was dealing with Cuban intelligence officers. He was in and out of the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. And Castro said in that speech at the University of Havana a couple of days after the assassination, we had no idea that he was at our mission in Mexico City. Now, these are blatant, flagrant, outright lies. I prove that in the book. I think beyond any reasonable doubt, you can find in my book that Castro lied. They did know. He and Cuban intelligence did know about Lee Harvey Oswald. You can say certainly that Cuban intelligence did. And if Cuban intelligence did, there's a very, very high probability that Fidel himself did as well. They knew that he'd been in and out of the Cuban embassy because Oswald was dealing with Cuban intelligence officers there. As many as 5 Cuban intelligence officers at the embassy in Mexico City. The truth of it is that there are now, and I catalog them in the book. They're listed in the introductory chapter to the paperback edition. I catalog the evidence that I collected to show that Fidel Castro has been lying about this. He lied about it days after the assassination, and now 50 years later, 50 years and 2 or 3 weeks later, they are still lying about it. Cuban intelligence, the Cuban leadership, Cuban propaganda consistently still lies about it. There was a defector. Now, my book, as many of you may know, my book is based in very large part on the reporting, the debriefings I did of former Cuban intelligence officers, defectors from Cuban intelligence, 6 or 7 of them. The first defector from Cuban intelligence was a man named Vladimir Rodriguez Laera, and he defected in Halifax in Canada. He got off a Cuban jet. He was on his way to Prague, from Havana to Prague. The flights in those days were long, and you had to stop and refuel. They stopped in Halifax, and he was able to get off, and he defected. Very quickly, he was in the hands of CIA officers. All of this is cataloged in the book, by the way. All of this is I tell all of this story in great detail about this man, Rodriguez Laera. He was given the CIA cryptonym Mug, A-M Mug. And Mug was the first of the important defectors from Cuban intelligence. This was April of 1964 when he defected. When A.M. Mug was brought to Virginia from Canada, Canadians were very, very cooperative, very helpful to get him into the hands of the CIA as quickly as that was possible. He began getting debriefed, and he told the CIA the following: Fidel Castro lied in that speech. So the CIA was told by this defector that Castro had lied. This defector also told the CIA, and by the way, this is all based on, all of what I'm telling you is based on declassified CIA documents. There are about 500,000 pages of declassified CIA documents at the National Archives. I read maybe 50,000 of those declassified pages, and everything I'm telling you about this defector now is from those declassified pages of documents. I also interviewed quite a few of these defectors that I mentioned. I interviewed a number of former CIA officers and quite a few others, a former U.S. senator and many others, dozens and dozens of interviews. Rodriguez Laera, Mug, A.M. Mug, told the CIA that Castro had lied when he said that we never in our lives heard of him. And Mugg told the CIA something else that's perhaps even more remarkable. He told the CIA, and this is in a report that's at the National Archives, if you want to look for it, he said, before, during, and after his visits to the Cuban mission in Mexico City, Oswald had been in contact with Cuban intelligence. Now think of that. Before September 1963, during those 5 or 6 days that Oswald spent in Mexico, and after. Now, after, he's back in Dallas. After is the 6 or 7 weeks before he assassinated President Kennedy. This source told the CIA, the document is at the National Archives. It's a CIA declassified document. I have not been able to find any evidence that these documents ever reached the Warren Commission. So the Warren Commission was never aware of the things that I've just told you. That at least there's no evidence that the Warren Commission ever deliberated about these issues. That Oswald was in touch with Cuban intelligence before, during, and after his visit to Mexico, and that Castro lied when he said we never in our lives heard of him. So that's, for me, that's prima facie evidence. That's pretty powerful evidence. This is a source, this defector, Rodriguez, was used by the CIA for a number of years, used constructively, used in espionage, used in counter-espionage. He was sent down to El Salvador with a CIA officer. All of this, I'm telling you, is from declassified documents. I'm not breaking any secrets here. He was sent down by the CIA with a CIA officer to San Salvador, and there he debriefed a Cuban asset, a Salvadoran asset who was not CIA asset, a DGI, a Cuban intelligence asset. So this Rodriguez was a reliable source, considered to be absolutely reliable by the CIA. So that was my first piece of evidence. Now, there was a Cuban intelligence officer. He was probably the head of the center, the Cuban center in Mexico City, who dealt with Oswald when Oswald was in and out of their mission. His name was Mirabal. And in the 1970s, when the House of Representatives set up a panel and an investigative committee to look into the Kennedy assassination, they were trying to find new evidence. They were trying to look at the Kennedy assassination from new perspectives with new evidence. They interviewed Mirabal, this Cuban intelligence officer, and his testimony is on the record. You can find it at the archives. You can find it online. And he told the investigators from the House of Representatives committee that he had filed a report with his headquarters in Havana about Oswald's visit at the embassy. We never in our lives heard of him. There was an incredible operation, a counterintelligence operation that the FBI ran against international communism at its highest levels. It was called Operation Solo. There's a book about Operation Solo. There's been a lot of declassified documents. I exploited quite a few of them. Operation Solo was not one person, it was two. It was brothers, Morris and Jack Childs. Morris, at least, was born in Russia. I'm not sure if Jack was born there or in Chicago after his family, a Jewish family. They left Russia, they went to Chicago, settled there. And the brothers joined the Communist Party, the American Communist Party. And Morris, the older brother, became very, very high, very influential in the American Communist Party. He became an aide, a trusted friend of Gus Hall, the head of the American Communist Party. Morris used to travel the world, in effect, as the foreign minister of the American Communist Party. There was no such title, of course. But he traveled in the capacity of the senior international affairs representative of the American Communist Party. And in that capacity, he met with Brezhnev and Kosygin, and he met with Mao Zedong. He met with all of the world's communist leaders, including Fidel Castro. Morris's younger brother Jack got into the whole Operation Solo. They worked for the FBI. They were both recruited by the FBI, Jack and Morris, Operation Solo, and for 15 or 20 years, Jack and Morris traveled to the communist capitals, sat down in the Kremlin, sat down in Havana with Castro, and everything they learned, they reported back to the FBI. It was one of the best counterintelligence operations that the Bureau ever ran. I'm telling you the story because in May or June of 1964, Jack, the younger brother, went to Havana. He had already been introduced to Fidel in Moscow, and Fidel had invited him to come to Havana. And Fidel completely trusted the Childs brothers because the Soviet leadership, the Chinese leadership, all the communist leaders trusted the Childs brothers as their own, as members of their own communist international clan. So Jack goes to Havana, and typically he was waiting for a meeting with Fidel, a private audience, as it were, with Fidel. It took about a week, and finally he got the call that Fidel was ready to see him. Jack sat down with Fidel. He wrote a report, a long report, which I have, which was declassified. It was in FBI files, but it's now declassified, and any of you can read it. Jack sat down with Fidel, and there was some small talk. There was some talk about the Afro-American, then called Black Power movements in the United States that Fidel was very interested in. He was interested in some other things. So Jack and Fidel chatted, and then Fidel finally said, I want to talk to you about that Oswald. Do you think he did it all by himself? And Jack just kind of evaded the question, didn't really answer it. And then Fidel said, well, I want to tell you something. He said, do you know what happened? He said, do you know what happened? When Oswald was leaving our embassy in Mexico City, do you know what he said when he was walking out? He shouted, I'm going to kill Kennedy for this. Fidel told this FBI agent, Jack Childs, that he knew that Oswald threatened to kill Kennedy in Mexico City after he had been meeting with Cuban intelligence officers. We never in our life heard of him, right? We never in our life heard of him. Fidel said, we never in our life heard of Oswald. This was just a day after Kennedy's death. And I'm explaining all of the reasons and for all of the evidence that I found that repudiates that shows that Fidel has been lying for 50 years. There are some other sources. I'll tell you another one that's a little more obscure. I don't think no other researcher or investigator ever noticed this. The American CIA station in Mexico City did some pretty good work back in those years in the early 60s, and their main targets were the Cubans and the Soviets. The Cuban embassy, the Soviet embassy, the Cuban intelligence and Soviet intelligence, because Cuban and Soviet intelligence had major operations out of Mexico City. So the CIA responded by constructing a huge operation of its own. It was probably our largest CIA station at that time in the world, and the Cuban station, or center they called it, was their largest anywhere in the world. The Cuban mission, including their intelligence center, were penetrated with tel-taps, with telephone taps and bugs. More telephone taps than listening devices. But there were both. And all of this, as I said earlier so many times, I want to repeat it if anyone came in late, all of this is found in declassified CIA documents. I'm not revealing any big secrets here. Maybe they're big. For many of us, they're new. There was a tel-tap, and a woman, a young, very attractive Cuban intelligence officer named Louisa Calderon. Louisa Calderon was on the phone with someone in Havana, presumably, based on the nature of the conversation, it was presumably one of her bosses at Cuban intelligence headquarters in Havana. And it was about 2 or 3 hours after Kennedy was shot. And she was very gleeful, by the way. She thought it was just the most wonderful thing that had happened, that Kennedy had been killed. And this is all on the record, too, in her tapped phone conversations. She was saying, oh, it was so wonderful. And I think they killed his wife and his brother, too. It was just really grotesque. She was just a young, true believer in the revolution. The man in Havana who was talking to her said, well, you know, this guy, this tipo, Oswald, he wanted to fight for Fidel. He wanted to go up into the mountains and fight for Fidel. And maybe he did, I'm not sure. And then she said, oh, that's enough. Let's not talk about that. And I began to put that together with something else that I had read. So now we have to go back to 1959. I'm still giving you more evidence. We never in our lives heard of him. Oswald's first contacts with Cuban officials, I show in the new edition of the book, his first contacts with Cuban intelligence occurred in Los Angeles when he was stationed at the Santa Ana Marine Corps base, El Toro it was called, in Santa Ana, which is greater Los Angeles. Oswald went there as Fidel Castro was winning power in January 59. Oswald went to El Toro around in maybe December 58, January 59. And Oswald wanted to go and fight for Fidel. He was so enthralled with the Cuban Revolution and with its bearded leader that he wanted to go and fight for Fidel in the Sierra. Well, by the time Oswald began seriously considering that, it was too late because Fidel was now in Havana. He'd won. So now Oswald is talking to a Marine buddy, and this Marine buddy, his testimony to the Warren Commission is very interesting. You can read it. It's easy to find online if you care to dig into any of this. Nelson Delgado is his name. Nelson and Oswald became buddies. Nelson is Puerto Rican, and Oswald and Delgado both were infatuated with the Cuban Revolution and with Castro. And they used to talk in the barracks about, oh, let's go volunteer and go fight for Fidel. And then after Fidel was victorious, the story changed a bit. We can go and fight for Fidel. We can help him bring those revolutions to those other countries. Because you remember that in 1959, the first year of Castro's regime, he and Che and Raul were supporting guerrilla bands in several other countries, the Dominican Republic and Haiti and several other countries. And Oswald and Delgado were saying, we got to go and help Fidel. We'll go to Cuba and we'll fight with Fidel and help him to bring revolutions to these other countries. So Delgado testified, told the Warren Commission that Oswald used to go down to the Cuban consulate in Los Angeles. And that one day some guy came, a man in a suit came to the barracks, and Delgado thought it was a Cuban from the consulate. And Delgado testified that Oswald would receive letters on very fancy letterhead that he presumed to be from the Cuban consulate in Los Angeles. So what I would like you to do here is join me, and maybe you will agree with me that these dots connect. Oswald was telling those Cubans in Los Angeles that he wanted to go up into the mountains and fight for Fidel. And this is exactly what that Cuban, the day of Kennedy's assassination, the Cuban in Havana was telling the Cuban intelligence officer in Mexico City. Remember, this tipo wanted to go and fight in the mountains for Fidel. Cuban intelligence had that in their files. What he told the Cubans in Los Angeles wound up in a file in the DGI offices in Havana. I don't think there's any other way to connect those dots. I've looked into this. Oswald never spoke publicly about fighting for Fidel and going up into the mountains. He maybe talked about it to his wife, the Russian girl Marina, but probably not to anybody else. I have found no evidence that anybody else, he ever shared those desires with anyone else other than Delgado and maybe Marina. So there's a whole pattern of evidence that you can find in the book. It's all now cataloged in the first chapter. We never in our lives heard of him. Of course they did. Oswald had been in touch with Cuban intelligence for probably as long as Rodriguez Layra said, the defector that I mentioned, before, during, and after his visit in Mexico City in September of 1963. Fidel Castro knew. Now, if you're familiar with my book, because the first edition of the book is very heavily focused on a defector, maybe the most important defector who ever came out from Cuban intelligence, Florentino Aspillaga. And I think you may know what Florentino Aspillaga told me, and that it was really after he told me this that I decided I really ought to try to write a book about this. He told me that on the morning that Kennedy was killed, November 22nd, 1963, he told me that he was working as he had been for a couple of months at a radio communications intercept site on the north coast of Cuba, not too far from Havana, near what's now the Hemingway Marina. Jaimanitas. In fact, Fidel has his Punto Cero, he lives near there now. This Aspillaga was a very young man. He was a teenager. He was working. He was trained. He went through about a year-long course in this kind of intelligence work, communications intelligence, and he was assigned to this listening post up on the north coast. And on the morning of November 22nd, he got orders from his headquarters: stop everything you're doing. Forget about your regular priority, which was listening in on CIA communications, on the CIA, possibly here in Miami. We had a huge base here in Miami. Listening in on the CIA motherships hovering off the coast of Cuba, because there were constant clandestine missions that the CIA was running against Cuba. The Kennedys really wanted to be rid of Castro. Stop everything you're doing. Forget about the CIA. Focus all of your equipment on Texas. We want to know if anything unusual happens in Texas. I said to Aspillaga, yeah. I said, what time was that? He said, it was in the morning. I said, what time? I said, when in the morning? Kennedy was killed at 12:30 Central Time, almost like the moment of 12:30 Central Time. I said, what time was it? He said, it was 9 o'clock, maybe 9:30, no later than that. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, Castro knew. He said, there's only one interpretation that you can put on this. Castro knew. I spent a lot of time considering whether I should believe Aspillaga. Obviously, I mean, this is really kind of an historic, truly historic, shocking, sensational story. And I did a lot of checking. I had never met him. I interviewed him back in 2007 and 2008. I had never met him back when he defected 20 years earlier, even though I was working at the CIA and even though I was doing work on Cuba. I had never met him back in those days. He checked out. I mean, I interviewed lots and lots of CIA officers, FBI officers. Many of them had spent time debriefing him in those years after he defected. This was a man with absolutely impeccable bona fides, the term of art in intelligence. Absolutely impeccable credentials, because everything he told his debriefers in American intelligence and counterintelligence, as far as I can determine, everything he ever told them turned out to be reliable. Hard, reliable information. I'll give you an example. He told the CIA that 48 or 49 secret agents, Cubans, that the CIA had recruited and the CIA was running. The CIA was conducting operations in Cuba using these 48 or 49 Cubans as spies. And Aspillaga told the CIA, they're all bad. Every one of them is actually a double agent run by Cuban intelligence against you, CIA. It was one of the most remarkable double agent operations in the history of spycraft. 49 or 50. The CIA was just humiliated. They don't like that I talk about this, by the way. It's not, it doesn't make for their day when this story is told and retold. It's all in the book. It's all in the book in great detail. But Aspiaga established his credentials, his bona fides, with stories like this. He told about members of Congress who were working for Cuban intelligence. He told about an American academics who were working, fully recruited agents for Cuban intelligence. He prevented a possible major penetration of the CIA. There was an American professor, a woman, teaching, a prestigious American professor, teaching at an American university. And she became a spy for Fidel. She was recruited by Cuban intelligence. She worked faithfully, diligently for Cuban intelligence, the way Ana Montes did, the woman that I worked with when she worked at the Pentagon. She was a Cuban spy. This American professor would travel, get her instructions from her Cuban handlers, and then she would do what she could to help Fidel, help Cuban intelligence. They wanted her to recruit one of her students, one or more of her students. So she began working on a boy, a young man, a Hispanic young man. I'm not going to tell you his national origin. A young Hispanic man. She began working on him and converting him into a Fidelista. And it took her a while, but he was receptive, and she was persuasive, and she was a true believer in the Cuban Revolution. So when she thought he was ready, when she thought that she had worked him up to the point where he was recruitable, she and he traveled to another country, a third country. I won't tell you which one. They traveled to a third country where the Cubans had lots and lots of intelligence capabilities, and there were very few American counterintelligence capabilities. So she and the kid showed up in this country, and she brings the kid to meet her Cuban intelligence handler, her agent, and she then introduces him and leaves the kid with the Cuban. The Cuban recruits the kid. So the kid is now going to work for Cuban intelligence. Guess what his instructions were? Apply for a job at the CIA. He was in process, I understand. Aspiaga came out in time to prevent that kid from ever getting the job. Now, if you wonder, maybe Latell is kind of exaggerating, maybe Latell is kind of gotten all of this wrong about this one sensational thing that Aspiaga told me. I knew about all these other things, and I knew how reliable he was. So I thought, I have to give this serious consideration. This is a sensational story that Castro knew Oswald was going to shoot at Kennedy. It's a sensational story, and all I have is the one source. But I did get a bit of kind of connective corroboration. I also was able to use a document, and I'm going to tell you just a little bit more, and then I'm going to stop, because hopefully there'll be some questions. When Aspiaga walked into the room where he and I were meeting, we were meeting in a secure location that I had rented a place so that I could meet him very, very discreetly. Cuban intelligence had tried twice to assassinate him, so I was concerned about his safety. So we met under very, very, very discreet circumstances. When he walked into the room where we were meeting, he handed me a box about this thick. He said, "This is my manuscript. This is the memoir that I wrote, and I want you to have it." He knew that I wanted to write a book, so he said, "I want you to have this." He said, "This is my whole story that's in this manuscript." So I said, "Oh, fantastic! Thank you." I was very grateful. I mean, what a bonanza it turned out to be, and there's a lot of it that's in Castro Secrets. So I just put it down on the table between us, and we conducted our interviews. I interviewed him for the rest of the day. And at the end of the day, after he left, I rushed to that manuscript. And I thought, if that story about the morning of November 22nd is not in the manuscript, then maybe he made it up after he spent some time here in Miami. Maybe he got contaminated. Maybe he decided to embellish his stories. I knew that he told me that he had written the manuscript not long after he came out. So I rushed to the manuscript, and I began frantically going through it. It's almost 300 pages. After quite a while, I found the page. There it was. The story that he told me about that morning was in the manuscript. I did one more thing. I was still what he gave me was an English translation of his manuscript, and I knew that he had written it in Spanish. I was very fortunate. I was able, not through the CIA or the FBI, but I was able, completely outside of government channels, was able to get a copy of the original Spanish language manuscript. So naturally, I did the same thing. I quickly went through it. Didn't take me so long this time because I knew about where it was, and there it was. The same language in Spanish, a good translation in English, completely consistent with what he told me. And then once I had done that, I said, I must take this guy seriously. Even this sensational thing that he told me, I must take him seriously. The story's never been told. So that's why I wrote the book. And the new edition has a lot of additional material in it, and I mentioned some of that at the outset. But I think I'll stop talking. It's been probably 30 minutes or so, huh? Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate your interest.
Folks, if you have a question for Professor Latell, please raise your hand and let me get to you with the microphone for the internet audience. Raise your hand and let me get to you with the microphone first.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you for the book, because, I'm almost finished with it because I found out about the book when I saw your interview on Fox. It was very brief, but you talked about it.
You saw the Fox interview?
Yes, yeah. I did. And so I, got the book and began reading it immediately, and it's very well written, very well researched. Everything is very clear.
Thank you.
And, to be honest with you, it's the best book that I have read in 2013. And I'm,
wow.
I'm an avid reader. I'm always reading about different things. You said something about Louisa Calderon when she got this call. I was under the impression that the call that she got came from Dallas, Texas. At least I think that's what I read in another book that is also on the same topic, on the same subject.
I don't know that.
Brothers in Arms by
Gus Russo.
By Russo and Moulton. When she's given the news and she says, well, I knew that even before Kennedy.
Yeah, she said, this same woman, I didn't mention this, thank you for bringing it up. She was in another conversation. I'm not sure it was from Dallas, though. I interpreted that conversation, this was another tap, a telephone intercept. I thought it was somebody in Mexico City she was speaking to, not Dallas, but maybe Gus is right. I'm not sure we'll ever know for sure. That conversation was pretty incriminating, too. Someone said, did you hear Kennedy was just killed? I knew almost before he did, exactly. She says. This Louisa Calderon is one of the most fascinating, intriguing mystery figures of the Kennedy assassination. And as I was saying earlier, I don't think the Warren Commission was ever even aware of her. The Warren Commission, CIA didn't tell the Warren Commission about her, about that conversation, about what I connected, the dots that I connected about Oswald wanting to fight in the mountains. Louisa Calderon was identified by Rodriguez Laera, the defector I mentioned. She was identified as a Cuban intelligence officer. So the CIA knew, Rodriguez knew, but I don't think the Warren Commission was ever told any of this. She was spirited out of Mexico City about a week after the assassination. She went into hiding almost immediately after the assassination. And she was spirited out and sent back to Havana. And as far as I know, she's never been heard from since. The House of Representatives I mentioned had conducted assassination inquiries. They went to Havana. That's where they interviewed Mirabal, who I mentioned. They wanted to interview Louisa Calderon. And she was sick. She was sick. She was not available. If she's still alive, she would be 71 or 72. She spoke fluent English. She had lived here in Miami as a child. I've really checked her out. I would love to go to Havana and try to find her, but I think I'd wind up where Alan Gross is.
Gentleman here had a question. Please speak into the microphone.
Hello. I was wondering,
Thanks for
no problem, if you could speculate on why you said the Lyndon Johnson administration and the FBI were hesitant or uncooperative.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I did kind of lead with some of that, and I didn't really follow up. In the new edition of the book, I have taken a tougher line than I did in the original hardback. Some friends of mine have been quite irritated with me because they think that I've gone too far, but I don't. The Operation Solo story about Fidel telling Jack that Oswald said he was going to kill Kennedy. The Rodriguez-Lahera before, during, and after. Oswald was in touch with Cuban intelligence. Rodriguez-Lahera telling the CIA that Castro lied. None of this ever reached the Warren Commission. Why? J. Edgar Hoover actually had a memorandum drafted. It was in June of '64. The Warren Commission was still functioning. They didn't issue their report until September. The Warren Commission was still functioning in June, and Hoover had a report written up about what I told you, Jack talking to Fidel and what Fidel said about Oswald. That report, Hoover twisted and minimized the significance of what Fidel told Jack. But even despite that, that report never reached the Warren Commission. It was lost somehow. And the things that I told you about from Rodriguez-Lahera never reached the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission was never informed that there were these CIA Kennedy plots to kill Castro. The day, it's another whole presentation, but I didn't go into it here tonight. At the moment Kennedy was killed in Dallas, a CIA case officer was meeting in Paris in a safe house with a Cuban agent, supposedly the man who was going to kill Castro for the CIA and for the Kennedys. At this very moment Kennedy was killed, the CIA officer was displaying the murder weapon to the Cuban. Now, the Cuban turned out to be a double agent. And so Fidel knew all about the Kennedy CIA plot to kill him. But none of this was ever told. The Warren Commission knew none of this.
That was Rolando Cubela, right?
It was Rolando Cubela. I interviewed him.
Cold-blooded killer.
He was. That's why the CIA thought he was the right man to kill Castro. I still haven't gotten to the bottom line here of your question. Would Richard Helms, I knew Richard Helms very well. I admired him. He was really a fine man, a principled man. I mean, he was an intelligence professional right down to the core, OSS. Would Richard Helms have withheld from the Warren Commission, this presidential commission, critical intelligence of the kind that I've mentioned? Would he have done it on his own? Or did he do it because he felt or knew that the new president did not want evidence accumulating indicating a Cuban hand in Kennedy's death? I suspect it was the latter. And that's what I say at the end of the new introductory chapter, and that's why a couple of my friends have said, too much. But read it if you care to.
I think I have an answer for that. I agree with you that Johnson did not want to find out the truth. At least he didn't want the American people to know the truth, because I think that he was afraid that the October crisis of '62 could metamorphose and become the November crisis of '63.
I think
This
that's right.
time, if the American people had known the truth, they were going to require the government to invade Cuba. And then there was the threat of a Soviet move on West Berlin, and that would have meant only one thing: the Third World War. Johnson didn't want that, and the best way to keep it from happening was to keep the American people looking someplace else.
I agree with you. A year ago I wouldn't have said all this, but now the additional research I've done this year in the paperback leads me to these judgments. I agree with you. And Bobby Kennedy, don't exonerate Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy never wanted to tell the Warren Commission about the assassination plots he was right in the middle of. Johnson was afraid. Johnson didn't want to have another missile crisis. I completely agree.
Because of that, I think that there were two people that wanted Lee Harvey Oswald silence. One was Lyndon Johnson, of course, and the other one was Fidel Castro. But Fidel Castro didn't have the, for obvious reasons, but he didn't have the means to have anyone in the basement of the Dallas Police Department on the day that Oswald was going to be transferred to the county jail. But Lyndon Johnson, who was from Texas and had some big shot friends there of all strands, I think that he was able to have an assassin there and silence this guy because he may have been afraid that Oswald, in exchange for his life, because he was not stupid, he knew that in Texas if you kill a police officer, it's an automatic death sentence. In his case, he not only had killed J.D. Tippit, the police officer, he had also killed the American president. So, he was in for the electric chair, So I think that Johnson was afraid that he might plea bargain with a prosecutor. You respect my life, and then I'll give you a full confession. And the whole thing would have come up, everybody would have learned exactly.
Interesting.
Did,
Well, I have sworn on a stack of Bibles never to talk about Jack Ruby in public. A very good friend of mine persuaded me that was the best course.
Professor Latell, one other question along those lines is you mentioned Marina Oswald earlier, and I've always been intrigued about the situation with Marina Oswald because on one hand you would think that this would be a gold mine to interview her in the aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination. She should be a wealth of knowledge, and yet some people seem to discount any of her testimony. Other people say that she changes her mind depending on who's asking. And it's like, what's your take on the reliability of Marina Oswald? Or
well, you have to know first of all that when she didn't testify before the Warren Commission until February. That was her first testimony. The assassination was in November, so it was 3 months later before she testified. And in those intervening weeks and months, she was interviewed incessantly, constantly, by the FBI and the Secret Service. And she fairly regularly lied to them. She wasn't willing to admit anything about Oswald's trip to Mexico City. That was ultra top secret. He didn't want anyone to know that he had gone there, and I think we know why. He wanted to defect to Cuba. That was his purpose in going to Mexico City. He wanted to defect and go and work for Fidel. But she lied about that. I forget how it was that they discovered during those months that he had also tried to kill the General Walker, because she knew about that. She didn't volunteer that until they discovered it on their own. Generally, the Warren Commission was skeptical of her when she did begin to testify finally in February. And they called her back to testify again in June because she had come up with something else that they felt, indicated that she had lied or misled or deceived them. So I think I think we may never know. She's alive. She's in Texas. She's 72 or 73. Her two daughters are grown. The two daughters she had with Oswald are grown. I think she has a son with a second husband. But I doubt that we'll ever know anymore. I don't think she's ever written a book. She did cooperate in a long book that was written by Patricia Macmillan Johnson and Lee and Marina, it's called, and that's based on many hours, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours perhaps of interviews with her. But it's still, I think it's still fair for observers and scholars to say, maybe she never really told us everything. Maybe she never told us the full truth even when she was talking. And we may never know.
Over here.
Thank you very much. Dr. Latell,
Hello, good to see you.
it's wonderful to see you and to reread your book. My question is about Lee Harvey Oswald. Have you looked into who he was, what kind of man he was, and why, based on what you know about Cuban intelligence and how it works, why they would select him if indeed he was groomed to conduct the assassination, why he would have been selected?
Let me, you give me a wonderful opportunity to make a very important clarification here. I don't believe, I haven't written, I've never said that they selected him, that they chose him, even that they wanted him. I think it was mostly from him, that he was thrusting himself on them. I do think that there's a very good chance, and I argue this in the book, that when he was in Mexico City, before he shouted that line, "I'm going to kill Kennedy," and we have to believe Jack Childs. We have to believe that Fidel reported that from his intelligence in Mexico, and that Jack Childs reported it accurately to the FBI. The FBI office in New York that wrote the report, I've read it. They said that Fidel had not been drinking, Fidel was coherent, Fidel was lucid, and that Jack was taking notes. Fidel was speaking in English, and there was someone else there present who could have interpreted when there were words Fidel didn't quite get. The FBI agent in New York wrote on the report to Hoover that this is undoubtedly true, that Fidel said this. Now, if Oswald said that, I think we can believe that Oswald said that. Why did he say it? My theory, and it's speculation, is that when he was in the Cuban embassy, he was wound up. He was wound up by the Cuban intelligence people that he was dealing with, Mirabal, Ascue, maybe Louisa Calderon, and one or two others, Vega. There were at least 5 Cuban intelligence there that he probably is known to have dealt with or probably dealt with. And my feeling is that they probably wound him up and filled him with anger and antipathy, and maybe told him about maybe he told them about his assassination attempt on General Walker, which was the previous April. And they knew they were dealing with somebody who could fire a gun and would not hesitate to shoot at somebody, and they knew that the Kennedys were trying to kill Castro, and they probably told him that. But he knew that too. He already had known that. So I'm not saying that Fidel orchestrated or ordered the assassination of Kennedy. I can't say that. And I can't say that they selected Oswald. I think he's thrust himself on them.
Just to follow up on that, the word "selected" was the incorrect word. Maybe, as you say, encouraged or groomed or somehow influenced.
Right.
Influenced. But it would the concern, would Cuba have had a concern that Oswald could have been traced back, and that would have put Cuba in a spotlight, and that's not necessarily what Cuba would have wanted in relation to any association with.
Sure, that's why Fidel insisted we never in our life heard of him. Fidel had to run as fast as he could from Oswald.
Do you think the FBI or anyone in the FBI knew about Oswald and what he was planning, and they just decided not to do anything about him?
The FBI certainly knew about Oswald. He had been, after all, remember, he defected to the Soviet Union. He lived in Russia and now Belarus for 2.5, almost 3 years. When he came back to America, the FBI interviewed him in Fort Worth when he went to live briefly with his mother in Fort Worth. He was followed, tracked, I think is a better word than followed, by an FBI agent in Dallas named Hosty. Hosty wrote a book about it. And when Oswald was in New Orleans, and he was demonstrating for Castro, doing all kinds of demonstrations, pro-Castro demonstrations, and did radio and TV pro-Cuba, pro-Castro in New Orleans. He also had an encounter. He requested an encounter with an FBI officer in New Orleans. There's no question that the FBI had a file on Oswald. So did the CIA. And they were negligent. They should have done a much better job. And the Warren Commission criticized them.
So my question was, do you think they knew he was going to try and kill Kennedy and decided?
Yeah, I ducked that. I ducked that. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, we know that J. Edgar didn't have much love for the Kennedys, but no, I don't think so. I wouldn't go that far. This lady, I think, had a question.
Did you have a question?
How will telecommunications interactions of systems affect what happens in Cuba related to the United States in the next few years?
Say again, how will telecommunications?
Right.
Well, yeah, it's a little bit, it's a little more futuristic. Cuba's really a black hole in terms of today still, in terms of modern communications. Very, very, very few Cubans can go on the internet. Very, very few. It's a very, very small penetration of the internet. Cubans are pretty isolated from international news, but less so now under Raul Castro than previously. So changes are occurring, but slowly.
All right, folks, then if there are no more questions, a reminder for our internet audience at home that if you'd like to purchase a copy of Professor Latell's book, just call the number on your screen and we'll take care of that for you, and we'll ship it to you for free anywhere in the United States. Also, all of our live streamed events are archived. So if you visit the Books and Books website and hit the live stream link, you'll see that any presentation that's been broadcast from here will be archived so you could watch it at your convenience. For those of you here in the store, we have the book for sale at the counter over there. Professor Latell is going to be signing over there at the little table to the left of the podium. And please give him a big hand for tonight's presentation. Thanks very much.